Welcome to the Davenport Public Library. It is September 25th, 2023. My name is Harrison Phillis. I believed I was described in the announcement for this as the Special Collections intern, which I conducted from during the fall semester of 2022, so last year. And that was a part of my practicum for my master's in library and information science, which I very thankfully just finished up with a few weeks ago. So a little about me. When I'm not doing this, I'm going to close out of this transcript window right here. Okay. A little about me. I am normally the special collections assistant over at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. I also graduated from there, class of 2019. And I majored in history and I minored in jazz studies. I play the drum set. I've been playing the drum set for a long time. I've also been involved with local music one way or the other for a long time. I started playing in school. I've been playing in independent groups, rock bands, metal bands for many years since I was a teenager. I participate as a member of the Black Hawk Pipes and Drums of the Quad Cities. I play the snare drum for them, and therefore I am very interested in both history and music and the history of music. And one of the things that I was interested in during my internship here was the special collections, the head of special collections, Catherine Whalen, told me about a project that they were working on about a local record label called Fredlo Records. And I thought, wow, I've lived here my whole life and I've never heard of this. And that and one of the requirements for my practicum was that I would give a presentation during the summer about a topic of my choice. So I figured, well, I really like history. I really like music. Let's try and do something with that. And since I've been involved with local music for such a long time, I'm very cognizant of the fact that there are a lot of local groups, musicians, venues maybe to a lesser extent that they don't get the celebrity treatment. When people think about music in the Quad Cities, the first name that they usually think of is Bix Beiderbecke, who we will mention a little bit later. But we know that there are a lot of there's a lot of music happening here, experientially, anecdotally, etc. So I thought it would be interesting to examine how do you research some of these other local musicians, local ensembles that don't get the same treatment as musicians like Bix. They're just not as famous. And maybe one of the questions people always ask for related to history is why? Why? Who cares? All that stuff happened years ago. Why should we care about it now? And when I was an undergrad at Augustana College, I didn't just study history, I studied local history. I studied the history of this place. And I think it's very important for people when they encounter history that it can be made real for them. The way we learn about history in school is often very, very abstract. It's you learn about people and places that happened somewhere else, but you rarely learn about what happened in your own backyard. So I thought I would examine some of the ways that we can research this history. Because we are able to do this kind of research about ourselves, about genealogy, We can better situate ourselves within historical movements. We can get a better sense of where we fit in the grand timeline known as history. We gain a fuller understanding of the place where we live and our friends and neighbors, the people who live here with us. And this, and not only that is not only for the immediate community in which we live in, but also the broader region of the Midwest. So tonight's presentation will be a bit of an exploration of the, the lives of a few lesser known local musicians via genealogical and local history resources. Yes. Yes. So when I first started doing this research, I thought, well, you know what? I'll just go into Google. I'll type, search for music in the Quad Cities. And one of the first results was this article, which I thought was extremely interesting. That the Quad Cities ranks 11th in the country for highest concentration of musicians. Now, this is per capita. That means that there are more active musicians here in the Quad Cities per capita than there are in cities like New York City, uh, Nashville, Tennessee, and as well as places like Las Vegas. In 2022, the Quad Cities employed 48.3 musicians and singers per 100,000 jobs, excluding traveling acts. So that's just people who live here. That's a lot of people, And one of the things I wanted to examine throughout this process was, has it always been that way? When did it? Because there's so many different kinds of music around here, and I just thought this was a very inspirational place for me to start my research. There's just something about the river. It's a quote by Tony Catalano, who was a lesser known but still very widely celebrated cornetist, who we will talk about here in a little bit. So, Quad Cities was not always here. Before this place was settled by various people, there was an indigenous population. There have actually been multiple, as indigenous peoples have moved to different parts of the country across history. And normally we think of the indigenous population here as being the Sauk and Meskwaki tribes, of which Black Hawk is one of the most well-known indigenous leaders from this region. But the Sauk and the Meskwaki are originally from further north. So they migrated to this region sometime in the 18th century, like late 18th century, mid to late. So before they were here, there were also Ojibwa, Potawatomi tribes, as well as Iowa tribes and Ho-Chunk. And we have a very important connection to the indigenous communities originally from here via the powwows that are done not quite every year, but they do them as much as they can. This was a musical event that I remember attending growing up, and it was really important me as somebody who's really interested in history to be able to have a little sample of the cultural heritage of Native American folks. So I wanted to acknowledge them to start. I'm not going to get very deep into founding of the Quad Cities. That is a whole other presentation in and of itself. Today, we are mostly going to be focusing on the music. So we are jumping forward to after the Quad Cities was founded, and people are starting to move in. Quad Cities has for a very long time been an important national intersection of transportation. The Arsenal Bridge is very long-lasting evidence of this. This is not the Arsenal Bridge of today. I believe this is the second Arsenal Bridge because the first one burned down after it was run into by a steamship, the F.E. Afton, and they replaced it. So the one that's there today is the third one. I believe this is the one before that. So travel is pretty central to the Quad Cities. This is very much a place of movement. We are at the time we would have been at the intersection of railroad traffic and river traffic, both of which are still in full use to this day. And now we have many highways crisscross through the immediate region. And those make it a lot easier, especially today, for musicians to tour and get from place to place. So as I previously mentioned, um, in the early days of the Quad Cities, there are a lot of immigrant groups. There are a lot of people. This is the frontier of the United States at that time, and so a lot of people are moving to this region from further east. They're coming here from Europe. There are a lot of different immigrant peoples who are settling in this region. And as many ethnic and cultural groups begin to migrate to the United States, they also bring their traditions, they bring their culture, they bring their heritage, and they bring their music. Who were they? What kind of music were they creating, enjoying? Um, and one major group was immigrants from Germany. There is still a very strong presence of German heritage in this place. There are places like the German American Heritage Center, which is a little further down the street. If you've done genealogy and if you have some German ancestry, you have probably used some of their resources. Many of this first wave of German immigrants came here in 1848. They were known as the 48ers. They were fleeing political upheaval in the form of the German Revolution of 1848. And while that was the first, there will be a few more periods of immigration due to political unrest and various reasons in Germany as well as in other countries in Europe in the following decades, even as far as forward as the mid 20th century about. And these people are bringing with them folk music. A few other communities which are moving to this region are not only Germans, but also there's a large Belgian population here. There was a lot of Swedish folks, Norwegian folks. That's the reason that Augustana College is where it is across the river, which is directly related to the last point about intersection, because the reason that they chose the location for Augustana College was so that it was closer to the railroad. So it was easier for incoming students to get to campus. There are also groups of Welsh immigrants and Czech immigrants, although the Czech immigrants, I believe, moved a little further north. That's more Cedar Rapids. We have all of these people. We have all these various types of people. They're doing various types of things. They're moving here. Many of them were tradesmen. Many of them were farmers. Some of them brought instruments with them. And I wanted to take this moment to introduce, how do you begin researching these people, just everyday folks? And Richardson Sloan Special Collections has a great deal of genealogy resources. They have a public computer where you can use sites such as Ancestry and Family Search, which are enormous aggregations of documents, birth records, death records, um, marriage and marriage records, um, newspapers, city directories sometimes. I also, throughout the course of my research, I also discovered things like yearbooks, which can also be helpful, especially if somebody started their musical career as a student. They also have manuscript collections about various topics related to local history. They have an enormous amount of vital records, census data, like I said. But there are some problems doing this type of research. This is before the advent of recorded music. So everything was heard live. If you weren't at the gig, you didn't get to hear the tunes. You'll have to make the next one. So that means that things like flyers become much more important. So do posters. These are the things that are announcing not only musical events but also social events, both public and private. And one of the first organizations and one that had a pretty lasting impact was the Davenport Zither Club, which was put together by an Austrian immigrant named Albert K. Farner. Albert migrated to the Quad Cities in, apologies, I believe that is on the next slide. Immigrant musical group. This was a club for all people who played the zither, which was factored pretty heavily into German folk music. And as German immigrants are moving to this region, they bring their zithers, and they decide that they want to put together an ensemble. They want to be able to share their music not only with one another, but with other people in the community as well. And apparently, Mr. Albert Farner was one of the premier zither players, which we'll get to in a little bit, but he was born to Jacob and Anne Farner in Austria, February 29th, 1864. This date is a little disputed. It depends on which census you're looking at. Some of them say 1863, some of them say 1865. This is something which happens quite often with genealogical research. His family emigrated to the US sometime around the year 1881. In his younger days, he worked as a saddler. And it seems that he had various occupations throughout his life. In his early days, he was mostly a laborer, so a lot of regular day-to-day laborer jobs. And in the 1900 census, he's listed as a musician. That is the census which is pictured. You can see it at the bottom of the screen. The top panel is the top of the page from the census record, and then the panel below it is the entry for Mr. Albert Farner. Up top, you can see his birth certificate. Yes. Yes. Oh, sorry, I cannot see my own slide. Yes, as our audience member just corrected me, that is another instance of census data. So, as I said, he worked various jobs, although in the city directory, it seems that for most of his life, he sold insurance. But we know that he did a lot of music on the side. He was in contact with the premier zither player in the United States of that time, which was a guy named Henry Warmsbacher, who was a concert zither performer and composer, and one of the most well-known champions of the instrument in America. He was an immigrant himself, originally from Germany, and immigrated to Cleveland, Ohio. Um, in Cleveland, Ohio. He would go on to assemble his American Zither Verband in 1914. The year before that, in 1914, our friend here, Mr. Albert Farner, organized the National Zither Players Convention in the United States, which was hosted here in Davenport, which is a pretty big deal. That means that not only was there a lot of support for this folk instrument and folk music here in the Quad Cities, but that other people were also willing to travel here to be able to celebrate that music. Um, when doing research on people like Albert, you're going to get a lot of valuable information from census records. Um, because he was an immigrant from Germany, it's unlikely that there will be a birth certificate in Ancestry, but they do have collections of European documents, so you never know. Um, and the middle photo there is a ticket from one of the Davenport Zither Club concerts at the Grand Opera House, 1910. Admission was 25 cents. Albert married Ida Wagner in 1904, and it seems that he continued selling insurance for the rest of his life. He lived to be 85. He passed on in 1950. Um, and this is going to bring us to our next era, I suppose, of local music, which is classical music. So Davenport's first band was formed in 1842. Anton Leclerc made a motion at a city meeting, which was voted down. So he purchased the instruments with his own money. Music was apparently very important to him. Um, and by 1897, there were enough working musicians in this region to form a local chapter of the American Federation of Musicians, Local 67. But it was preceded by other groups. People were organizing their own bands, one of which is the most well known and is going to be one of the predecessors to the next group in question, is the the German Union Band under the direction of Jacob Strasser. Similar to their later contemporaries in bands and ensembles, they were often featured at public as well as private events. They also performed on railroad cars and riverboat excursions. Again, this is before recorded music and and before the general proliferation of radio. So there's no radio on the boat. If you want music, you got to bring the whole band. And that brings us to the Tri-City Philharmonic Orchestra is the band that kind of took root after after the German Union Band and some other local ensembles have been operating for a while. There's enough musicians around here for a local union chapter. And there's starting to be more and more musicians in this region. And eventually a lot of them together, and they decide to form the Tri-City Orchestra, which will later be renamed the Quad City Symphony Orchestra. And this seemed the next natural place for me to take this presentation. So I was starting to do some research and I was looking at the early member lists. And who do I find on this list? I found the first program for their first concert, and listed under the cellos, there will be a picture of the program on the next slide, but listed under the cellos is a musician named A. Farner. And I was like, oh, that's funny. I wonder if that's the same guy as our zither aficionado. Turns out it most certainly is. That is Albert Farner, listed under the cellos. On the previous slide, he was listed as AK. And you can see over on the right, that is the first Tri-City Symphony Orchestra program. They performed works by German composers such as Richard Wagner. They were apparently very with the times as far as their program curation went. All of the founding members of this orchestra, the players is somewhat obvious, but also the members of the board were all musicians themselves. And they wanted to get together and have an ensemble so that they could bring this classical music, which they all enjoyed, to this region and be able to play it for themselves as well as many others. So the next era after classical music that most people think of in the development is jazz. And one of the most well-known musicians from the Quad Cities period is a man named Bix Beiderbecke, who was a cornetist. As we now know, we now host the Bix Foot Race is now held here every year, as well as a jazz festival dedicated to Bix. This was something that a few musicians from New York began in the 1970s because they found out about Bix's music. They thought it was a great travesty he was not memorialized in any capacity. So now we have this festival. So Bix was not very well known in his day, but he was well known among musicians. He was well known among his contemporaries. There are stories that he at one point met Louis Armstrong when they were both playing on the riverboats. This is anecdotal. They're not quite sure if this actually did happen or not, but possibly it did. Certainly that they were both playing in riverboats on the river around this time. And as somebody who plays the drums, I wanted to mention Louis Bellson, who was originally from Rockford but grew up in Moline. His father ran a music store there. He is somewhat notorious as the first drummer to use two bass drums for his setup. He's largely thought of as the first person to popularize that, which when he became famous, that gave more room for advertising space. So when he sits in with bands such as Duke Ellington's band, they can advertise themselves on both bass drums. He is widely hailed as there's a typo there. He's widely hailed as one of the most legendary swing drummers of the first half of the 20th century. So these guys are titans. You know, they're well known by a lot of people, and there are a lot more musicians who never get recognized as much, which brings us to the relevant context for the time period. As said previously, both musicians like Bix Beiderbecke and Louis Armstrong were playing on riverboats. The riverboats were one of the main sources of transportation for both goods and people in this region. There was a great amount of competition between the riverboats and the railroads, but they both squashed that argument when it became clear that they were both here to stay and they both had their own pros and cons. So, and even before this, the Mississippi River system has always been very heavily used for transportation. And with the increased use of riverboats in this region leads to an event known as the Great Migration. And rather than this being immigrants coming from the United or coming to the United States from Europe, this is African American people who are fleeing both the extremely oppressive and extremely violent Jim Crow laws which were enacted upon them in the southern United States. And one of the things that they bring with them is their music. And this takes the form of what we now call Dixieland jazz, which is the musical tradition that people like Dix were drawing from. Another very well-known musician who used to sometimes play in the Quad Cities was named Fate Marabelle. I think it's possibly Fate Marab, because I believe that might be French, but am not positive. And here in the pictures are a few examples of riverboats. On the left are a few riverboats passing downtown Davenport, and on the right are 4 riverboats which are docked. The boat on the far left was originally called the Dubuque. It sank in 1901, but it was raised and refurbished by Streckfus Steamers, eventually being renamed the Capitol. This is where Fate and his band would gain a great deal of acclaim performing on this boat. A little more about him. As I said, unrest and racial biases compelled many African Americans to move north. Many of the musicians would play on the riverboats. One of these was Fate Marabelle, who notably played with integrated bands. This was at a time period just before bands started to become segregated. And I wanted to include a little information about him so that I could discuss this visual, which Fate was a keyboard player, he was a piano player, and one of the parts of his job playing on the riverboats was he had to play an instrument known as the steam calliope. There's a picture of it there at the left. It was a collection of whistles. They were made from copper, and they were powered from the steam from the engine of the boat. This was apparently a completely horrendous instrument to play because it didn't sound great. It never stayed in tune. There was constantly very, very hot, very highly pressurized steam going through the pipes. And the water presented all kinds of problems because it was steam coming from the engine of a very large machine. The keys were very hot, so these players would have to wear gloves when they were playing this thing. But it was so powerful, it could be heard for miles. It could be heard for miles up the river and down and in the surrounding region. And I thought that was a phenomenal spectacle. You can see this great riverboat coming down the river, but you hear it probably like half an hour before you can actually see it. And that's a bit of context about where the environment where some of these bands are playing. And over on the right, you can see him with his signature hat and stogie that he always had. He always smoked a cigar, pictured with his band, an integrated band of musicians. The one at the far right being a cornetist from Rock Island named Tony Catalano. You'll remember his quote from the beginning. You can see hopefully you can see, he's holding his cornet under his arm at the far right. He's our next He's our next focus. Tony Catalano was born in Indianapolis to Italian immigrants in 1882 on July 22nd. He achieved a fair amount of local notoriety. He was a very well-known player. He got his start playing with Marvell's band and played on the John Streckfus steamer. This was before, like I said, the American Federation of Musicians segregated bands. Segregated bands around the turn of the century. The decision was made that from then on, bands were going to be segregated. So Tony played with Fate's integrated band. And he was known in this region. He would take on a role similar to his own mentor, Fate, where he would find up and coming talent. He'd find young talent, people who were playing out and about in the area, and asked them to come play with his band. And this is how, and he continued to play on the riverboats despite the decline of riverboat transportation for most of the rest of his life, until the riverboat transportation infrastructure really declined after World War II. He would later turn down engagements with higher profile musicians, higher profile bands, because he loved playing on riverboats. A lot of the information I was able to find about Tony comes from the newspapers, announcements for performances of his bands, when boats were going to be traveling, where the bands were going to be appearing. They would also say what city, if it was going to be, if a boat was going to make a stop somewhere down the river, they would sometimes announce that in the local paper. He also had an orchestra a little later in life called the Commanders, but before that, he had a band with piano player Carlisle Evans, which was called the Tony and Evans Capital Jazz Band. I could not find confirmation of this, but I have the suspicion that the name Capital comes from the Capital steamboat that he so very frequently played on. And here, this is a newspaper advertisement for their band featuring the other members of said band. And as I was continuing with my research, and I was kind of looking for more musicians, more leads to follow, I thought, I'll look into his drummer. I play the drums. Let's see what's going on with his drummer. I can only imagine what it must have been like to be a drum set player, having to haul a drum set on and off the riverboats throughout various cities at this time period. Moving drums is a lot of work. I am very envious of other musicians who only have one case. I have about 5 or 6 whenever I go to a performance. So I was like, Jack Willett. All right, let's see what there is to be found about Jack Willett. And this is where I started to run into problems. And if you've done any sort of genealogical research before, you know that there isn't always information to be found about some of these people. This came up with Tony Catalano, where he's mentioned in some censuses, which are available online through websites like Ancestry and Family Search, but these websites are not comprehensive. They have as much as they can, but some collections of these materials have been lost. Like there are entire years of the census which are no longer, because they had a, for example, they had a fire at the National Archives. They all burned. So you, your mileage varies pretty regularly as you're doing this kind of research. So I unfortunately couldn't find a birth certificate for him, but some of that information can be found later through things like obituaries in the newspaper. Um, if anybody wrote a tribute about somebody in the newspaper, that's a place where you're going to find that type of information. Um, and so when I searched Jack Willett, I got a lot of false hits because his name was Leo. His name was not Jack. That was a nickname which he had throughout his life. I could not find why. He was a veteran. He was a World War One veteran. He it's also unclear. It's also unclear when he started playing the drums. I couldn't find any definitive date. I couldn't find any definitive event. Again, this is not very surprising when you're doing research into people like your family members who, I mean, I know that I don't have any very famous family members, and I know that a lot of other people also do not, which means that a lot of these people are just everyday folks. They work, they they play in bands, you know, and so information is sometimes spotty. He performed around the Midwest for vaudeville shows, theater shows, and other types of traveling shows. Performed with local bands such as the Tony and Evans Capitol Jazz Band, as previously mentioned. And he would later head his own orchestra, the Jack Willett Orchestra, which would play concerts, dances in the Quad Cities region throughout the 30s and 40s. Um, he worked, he worked at the Rock Island Arsenal for 23 years. He retired from there. He was a production assistant, and it seems that he devoted his life to entertaining others. You can see over there, he was a member of the Mississippi Valley Major. He was a member of a softball team, which competed in the Mississippi Valley Major Softball League. Um, he played with the Arsenal team. And one of the things that I found while I was researching our friend Jack here was that he was very inspired by a trip to the circus. There was a traveling two-car circus that came to the Quad Cities in the early 20th century, and he went when he was a young person, and he couldn't get enough of it, which led to me finding out something very interesting about him. Here's some more information about Jack. He was a World War One vet. You can see the final roster for his company on the left. And the reason why on the last slide it seemed like he always wanted to entertain people is that he has this legacy of being an entertainer throughout his life, playing in local bands, a variety of engagements. But most interestingly, and I had to do some double checking to make sure that this was the same person, but he had a miniature circus. He was so inspired by going to the traveling circus whenever it would come through town that he dedicated a very great portion of his life to building and maintaining this miniature circus. And I found an article about this where it said that he never had to wait. He never had to wait again. He never had to wait for the circus to come back to town because he always had one. And he would bring it to various types of events in the area. He'd sometimes bring it to Mississippi Valley Fair. All of the cars were all of the Everything was handmade, hand painted. He did it all himself. It was apparently quite the attraction. I found multiple tributes written about this around the time that he passed away. And he also related to the circus. He was also known as performing as a clown named Jocko, which so it seems that not only was he a musician, but he was interested in entertainment more broadly. And I thought it was very interesting more that I looked at people like that, people like Albert Farner, that these people don't just have one thing. They don't just do one thing. They have multiple areas of interest, whether that's various genres of music. Uh, our friend Albert played with the symphony as well as local folk zither ensembles. And Jack had his miniature circus along with playing in his jazz orchestras and playing on the Arsenal's baseball team. And I think that's important to include because in my experience, there are many local musicians are more than just musicians. If you're involved in music, you're also, you know, maybe you have to make your own artwork for your album covers or your flyers, or maybe you have to learn about recording, things like this. So that was a very interesting tie between the past and the present. So as we move through the 20th century and we're examining these musicians, the research process changes a little bit. Not a ton. I mean, for the very early, for the late 19th century, early 20th century, there's no recorded music. So a lot of the evidence of musicians and ensembles, bands is going to be, as I said before, posters and flyers, and newspapers. And luckily today, there are very large newspaper databases, although there are many organizations which also have newspaper indexes. So I wanted to include what kinds of things should you be looking for if you're looking for evidence of bands, ensembles, performances. It's good to know what type of ensemble it is. That's going to allow you to get more specific. If you know what specific event was taking place, that's going to hopefully give you a little more insight. Um, and also what groups of people were responsible for putting on these events that people are going to is also going to help you drill down and figure out more information about where these bands are playing, where and why. Um, you could search by genre. Obviously, if you search for jazz, you're going to get different results than if you search for an orchestra. And the other major issue with searching for bands is that it's usually only the band leader that's mentioned. It's um, the Tony and Evans Capitol Jazz Band or the Jack Willett Orchestra. That only mentions one person. That doesn't give you any insight into the musicians who were playing with them. So as far as that goes, that's where things like programs are going to come, especially in handy. There's going to be some articles which mention what types of who the supporting musicians are, but again, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, your mileage certainly will vary. And I wanted to, as somebody who, oh, screen, lost the screen. I think our projector went to sleep. We should still be streaming. So just imagine. So I wanted to mention a few other things that are helpful when you're doing this kind of research, like triple checking your sources. This came up when I was researching Jack Willett. His name wasn't Jack. His name was Leo. Also musicians like Albert Farner is sometimes not mentioned by name, sometimes it's just AK. And there are other Albert Farners in the region. They're at various time periods. So it's good to triple check that the person on the document that you're finding is in fact the person you are looking for. Because you're sometimes going to get false positives, sometimes you're going to get false negatives. Another thing to keep in mind is try to corroborate your information with as many sources as you can find. This is much easier said than done, but it's always worth it to try. And as you are going through, you should be recording your citation information. Even if you are not giving a talk like this, I would bet a lot of money that there's gonna come a day where you're gonna find some piece of information in your notes and you're gonna say, where did I find that? And if you didn't write it down, you're gonna create a whole lot more work for yourself in the long run. So it's also very important, besides citation info, to save files as needed, save copies as needed, especially if you're browsing online resources. And last but certainly not least, keep looking, keep looking, keep looking. If you find a dead end, keep looking.
The library is closing in 30 minutes. The library is closing in 30 minutes.
Moving forward with contemporary music, more contemporary music. As we move through the 20th century, we get the advent and continued popularity of music recording, not only appearing on via formats like radio, but also recorded formats like mostly in the mid 20th century, mostly records, vinyl or acetate. With the increased popularity of music listening, there is increased popularity of more music genres, especially outside the traditional band context, traditional orchestra, large ensemble context. And this is going to lead to more jazz, more rock and roll. Folk groups and country groups are going to start being recorded in the mid 20th century. And the picture on the left is the logo for the local record company, Fred Lowe, which we will get to in just a second. So Fred Lowe is a portmanteau of the two people who owned it, Frederick and Lois Mock. To expand on the last point, I had an extremely difficult time finding resources about Lois. I found many documents on Ancestry which had various last names. It was extremely difficult for me to tell exactly which Lois was the Lois that I was looking for. And I also, it's possible that it was buried somewhere. It's possible it was hidden from my viewing somehow, but I could not find a marriage certificate for Fred and Lois, which is not unheard of. This is something that happens from time to time when you're doing this type of research. So Frederick Mock was born to Harry and Ida on April 24th, 1913, in the town of Yetter, Iowa. This is close to Boone. Played clarinet in both his high school band and his high school orchestra in the high school in Boone. And he was involved with local music. He had his own orchestra during the early to mid 1930s, which reportedly played all throughout the Midwest, as far north as the Canadian border and as far south as places like Kansas. So you can see his birth certificate there on the right, and you can see a picture of him later in life sporting a pipe, and you can see some of his sound recording equipment in that photo. Going back to his high school, websites like Ancestry will have, sometimes they will have yearbooks, which is where I found these two photos of the ensembles that Frederick participated in, Freddie, when he was in high school playing the clarinet. He was not only playing in both ensembles, but he was the junior student director of his high school band. So clearly, he had quite the interest in music. With increased support and interest in music in the mid 20th century, there comes more music education. There's a more proliferation of music being taught in schools, which is clearly how Fred Mock got his start. And we know that after school, like I said, he played in various local ensembles, so he apparently could not get enough. He later would found Fred Lowe Studios, which would start as he started recording at Inner City Recording Service in 1948, which would provide transcription services. They are listed in the 1949 City Directory as a transcription service. And it had been in the business for a few years before he eventually took it over with his wife Lois, and they rechristened it as Fred Lowe Studios, the combination of both their names. And this was happening as early as 1951. The first recordings were done on acetate. They were cut for a local dance studio, and it was after this point that they started doing recordings for other local artists. He would work as a projectionist before this in the 40s, on top of being a local musician, and it seems that this was around the time he became interested in audio recording. This was done at the time before you could go to college to become an audio engineer. So Fred Mock was entirely self-taught, based on books, pamphlets. According to the newspaper article, he was self-taught with books, pamphlets, and all available data, according to a 1958 article from the Daily Times. And he appears in other articles as a local audio expert. So not only was he a musician, he became interested in recording. And it seems that his studio was one of the main ones in this area for a variety of local groups. You can see a photo of Fred Lowe Studios there on the left. So one of the things that I did as the intern here at Richardson Sloan Special Collections was Catherine Whalen, the head of Special Collections, gave me a list of items from the Fred Lowe discography that they were looking to collect for the archive. Because one of the projects that Richardson Sloan Special Collections has going is they are trying to find and digitize the entire catalog of Fred Lowe recording studios. This is no small task. A lot of these releases were extremely limited. This was a pretty small label. There's a discography of 287 items, acetate, vinyl records, which included singles, 78s, and then LP records, as well as there is one open reel tape, apparently. There's no complete discography for Fred Lowe Records, which provides a bit of a problem. Although clients in the region seem to have included local artists and performers in various genres, as well as local high school ensembles, local college ensembles. They did recordings for the Kappa Shriner Band, other bands which were attached to fraternities such as the Kappa Shriners. And because there's so little information remaining, this information has to be found from the physical artifacts themselves, which is why it is so important that all of these artifacts can be compiled in one repository. And as I said, one day Catherine Whalen gave me a list of items and said, try to find these online. Check eBay, check other online marketplaces, and especially check Discogs. Discogs is an user generated, it's sort of like Wikipedia, but for music, specifically music formats. Um, it is encouraged that if you are going to upload entries for items to Discogs, that you have the item sitting there right in front of you. This is oh hey, our screen's back. Um, this is what they tell you when you're cataloging books also. So, and as you can see, it has the list of items over there in the large photo at the right. And that is page 1 of 3, and it only lists 215. 215 items out of 287, which is a lot of missing items. But as you start to look at the entries for some of the 78s, the 45 singles, a lot of them were extremely limited. There was maybe only 100 copies of some, which is next to nothing in terms of what we now think of as music distribution. So one of the reasons that they're trying to not only compile these items, but also digitize them is so that more people can have access to this very important piece of cultural heritage for the Quad Cities region. And as we move through the 20th century, as it gives way to the 21st, the infrastructure for music has grown to staggering new heights. Most people don't buy CDs, let alone records anymore, although there has been a resurgence in recent years. A lot of people are simply content to just stream their music. And with the advent of all this music technology, there are more and more musicians, record labels, venues, and publications, and media now than ever before, as well as independently operating artists. And as technology improves, we are afforded more resources to conduct local history and genealogical research than ever before, which is good for us, although it can be a little overwhelming sometimes. It also depends on what exactly is online. And I wanted to share a few contemporary resources for looking at local music. I found seemed like a very interesting book during my research by Chad Holtkamp, who wrote music reviews for the Dispatch Argus. And this book compiles all of the reviews for local bands that he compiled from 1999 to 2005. There are independent efforts like the Quad Cities Music Archive, which is little more than a Bandcamp page. Bandcamp is free. Anyone can make an account for free, and I am not sure who took it upon themselves to make the Quad Cities Music Archive on Bandcamp. I have a feeling that I know who it is, but I'm not entirely sure. People like that become very important for remembering local bands and local ensembles. And there are even some venues, such as the independent venue Roztalks in Rock Island, which has as many posters as they can from all of the shows that they've had on their website. So thankfully, there is more now to be found than ever before. Still to this day, many of these ensembles that we've mentioned, many of the independent musicians that we have are still operating. They're still going very strong. There are still powwows, which happen here every year that they can. Some are hosted on Credit Island in Davenport, and some are hosted at Blackhawk State Historic Site. They help to keep cultural heritage alive. Remember the Zither Club? Davenport Zither Club is still one of the largest in the country. They are having an event where they're celebrating their legacy in about 2 weeks. So I figured I would highlight them there. And groups like the Quad Cities Symphony Orchestra, previously called the Tri-Cities Symphony Orchestra, will have their 109th season this year. All of which is to say that music continues to have an enormous impact on human life and culture. We are very lucky to have a such vibrant and far-reaching, historically, music community here in the Quad Cities, and I wanted to take this evening as an opportunity to explore some of the players and some of the musicians in this community and this region. So here is my selected works cited. Did not have enough room for everything that I looked at, and even if I did, you wouldn't have been able to read it. So selected works cited. Thank you all for being here, both in person and online on this Monday night. Thank you very much. We'll now take questions. I did go a little over my time, but we are now taking questions. If anyone has. You're very welcome. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming.
The library is closing in 15 minutes. If you'd like to apply for a library card, please do so at this time. Computers will be shutting down at 5 minutes before closing. The library is closing in 15 minutes.
We have a hand in the front row. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering if you might know of what was the first recording to have been made in Quad Cities? You know,
For Fredlo or just in general?
in general.
I do not. That was not a piece of information I was able to find. I was able to find one of the first acetates, which was of an independent artist by Fredlo, was by an artist named Bill Ingogli.
Yes.
Ingogli. Not entirely sure about the pronunciation.
He also went by the name Bill.
Okay. Yes. Right.
And his son still lives in.
Oh, good. That's very cool. It's amazing how many of these musicians or their families persist in this area. Yes. In case there are any questions come in from the chat.
Is it possible to see the picture?
Oh, do you want me to go back?
If you don't mind.
Didn't manage to find any good pictures of Lois, but I found a few of Fred.
Look at him.
There he is. You can see his pipe and his reels. Oh, I would love to see a better picture of that tape machine. I love tape machines. I think tape machines are awesome. I bet that is one amazing piece of equipment. So that's Fred, and there's another picture of him right there from the newspaper. There are very many Parmans in the musicians lists from. So if you are doing research into the Parmans, it seems like there's probably a lot of ground to cover there.
Yeah. Sometimes it's spelled with 4 A's.
Touche. Okay, well, thank you all for coming. I believe we are going to sign off here. Hope everybody in chat has a wonderful evening. Thank you for sharing it with me.